The Atlantis of the Sands, Ubar's 5,000-year secret. The satellite passes over the Arabian desert at midnight. 22,000 miles above the sand, sensors detect something impossible. Beneath 40 feet of dunes, patterns emerge, straight lines, right angles, the geometric precision of human construction where nothing should exist. NASA scientists stare at the images in confusion. According to every historical record, according to centuries of exploration, there is nothing out here, just endless sand. But the satellite doesn't lie. Something massive is buried beneath the empty quarter, the most desolate region on Earth. Something that has been waiting in darkness for 3,000 years. When archaeologists finally reach the site in 1992, when they begin to dig, when the first stones emerge from the sand, they realize they have found something that was never supposed to be real. A city from legend. A place that Islamic scholars called a myth. A civilization that the West dismissed as Arabian fantasy. Yubar, the Atlantis of the Sands, is not a story. It is here, and its discovery rewrites everything we thought we knew about ancient Arabia. The desert remembers. Long before Islam, before Christianity, before Rome or Greece built their first temples, caravans crossed the Arabian Peninsula carrying a substance more valuable than gold. Frankincense, the hardened resin of Boswellia trees, burned in temples from Egypt to Babylon, required by every religion, demanded by every king. A pound of frankincense commanded the same price as a pound of gold. Entire economies rose and fell on the frankincense trade. And somewhere in the southern reaches of Arabia, hidden in mountains where the Boswellia trees grew wild, there existed a city that controlled it all. The Arabs called it Yubar, the people of Ad, a civilization so wealthy that their buildings were said to have columns of red gold, so powerful that their caravans stretched for miles across the desert, so arrogant that they defied the warnings of prophets. The Quran mentions them briefly, a people destroyed by God for their sins. Medieval Islamic scholars wrote of a great city swallowed by the sands, punished for its hubris. European explorers heard the stories and dismissed them as folklore. Lawrence of Arabia searched for Yubar in the 1920s and found nothing but dunes. By the 20th century, most historians agreed. Yubar was a legend, a cautionary tale, an Arabian Atlantis that never existed outside of religious texts and tribal memory. But the Bedouin knew better. For 3,000 years, their ancestors had passed down stories of ruins in the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. They spoke of ancient roads still visible beneath the sand, caravan routes that had been traveled for millennia before they were abandoned. They told of a place where the earth had opened up and swallowed an entire city in a single night. Western archaeologists ignored them. How could an advanced civilization exist in the most inhospitable desert on Earth? How could a major city vanish so completely that not a single stone remained visible above ground? The empty quarter stretches across 250,000 square miles of southern Arabia. It is one of the largest sand deserts on the planet. Summer temperatures exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no water, no vegetation, nothing that could support a major settlement. The conventional wisdom said that any significant Arabian civilization would have developed along the coasts or in the northern regions where water was more available. The idea of a lost city in the heart of the empty quarter seemed absurd, until an amateur archaeologist and a documentary filmmaker decided to stop listening to experts and start listening to the desert itself. Nicholas Clapp was not a trained archaeologist. He was a documentary filmmaker obsessed with Arabian history. In the 1980s, he began researching the frankincense trade, trying to understand how such a valuable commodity had moved from southern Arabia to the ancient world. He read medieval Arabic texts that European scholars had dismissed as myth. He studied the accounts of Ptolemy, the Greek geographer who had mentioned a city called Omanum Emporium in southern Arabia around 150 AD. He talked to Bedouin tribesmen who still remembered the old caravan routes their grandfathers had described. And he realized something that the academic establishment had missed. The legends all pointed to the same location. A region near the modern border of Oman and Yemen, where ancient trade routes converged, where frankincense trees grew in the nearby mountains, where water might have been accessible through underground aquifers. Clapp convinced NASA to analyze satellite imagery of the region. The scientists were skeptical, but they agreed. In 1984, They turned their orbital cameras toward the empty quarter. What they found changed everything. The images showed tracks beneath the sand, faint lines, barely visible, running in straight paths across the desert, caravan routes, some of them stretched for hundreds of miles, and all of them converged on a single point near a place the Bedouin called Shissa. When the team enhanced the images using radar that could penetrate sand, they detected something more substantial: the outline of walls, large structures, an extensive settlement. Clapp assembled a team of archaeologists, including Dr. Juris Zarins from Missouri State University. They secured funding, obtained permits from the Omani government, and in November 1991, they arrived at Shissa with ground-penetrating radar and a determination to prove that Yubar was real. The local Bedouin watched them with quiet satisfaction. They had always known something was buried there. Their fathers had found pottery shards in the sand. Their grandfathers had spoken of columns emerging from dunes after windstorms, only to be buried again by the next sandstorm. Now, finally, someone was going to dig deep enough to find the truth. The first stone wall appears 3 feet beneath the surface, then another, then a tower foundation. Within days, the archaeologists uncover an octagonal fortress with walls 20 feet high and towers at each corner. The fortress is built from limestone blocks, each weighing hundreds of pounds, fitted together with precision. Inside the fortress, they find the remains of houses, workshops, storage facilities, and everywhere pottery, thousands of pottery fragments from across the ancient world. Greek ceramics from the 4th century BC, Roman glass from the 1st century AD, Persian vessels, Syrian jars, Egyptian amulets, the debris of international trade scattered across what was supposed to be an empty desert. But the most important discovery lies outside the fortress walls: a crater, a massive sinkhole 40 feet deep and nearly 300 feet across, directly adjacent to the ancient settlement. At the bottom of this crater, partially collapsed buildings. Stone columns, walls that plunged down into darkness. The city did not simply decline and fall into ruin. Part of it fell into the earth itself. The geology tells a story that the legends had preserved. Beneath the empty quarter lies a vast limestone cavern system created over millions of years by underground water. These caverns provided the water that made Yubar possible. Wells were dug down into the aquifer, allowing the city to exist in the middle of a desert where no city should survive. For perhaps 3,000 years, Yubar thrived on this underground water source. The frankincense caravans stopped here to water their camels and replenish supplies before the long journey north to Mesopotamia or west to Egypt. The city grew wealthy. Its merchants built stone fortresses. Its rulers commissioned buildings with columns and decorated walls. And then, sometime around 300 AD, the limestone cavern beneath the city collapsed. The earth simply opened up. Buildings tumbled into the crater. People fell into darkness. Water sources disappeared in an instant. The city that had been the hub of the frankincense trade for millennia became uninhabitable overnight. Survivors abandoned the ruins. Sandstorms swept across the empty quarter. Within a generation, the dunes had buried everything. Within a century, Yubar had become a legend. The artifacts tell us what life was like before the collapse. The pottery shows us the international nature of the frankincense trade. Merchants from across the ancient world came to Yubar or sent their goods here, exchanging manufactured items for the precious resin. The city was not isolated. It was a crossroads, a place where cultures met and traded and shared ideas. The frankincense itself was harvested from Boswellia trees in the nearby Dhofar Mountains, about 3 days' journey to the south. Collectors would wound the bark of the trees and wait for the sap to harden into resin. This resin was then transporting to Yubar on camel caravans. At Yubar, it was stored, weighed, taxed, and repackaged for the longer journey north. A single caravan might carry 2 tons of frankincense. At ancient prices, this represented wealth equivalent to millions of dollars in modern currency. The merchants who controlled this trade became extraordinarily rich. And the city that sat at the center of the trade routes controlled the entire economy. The fortress itself reveals the military reality of desert trade. This was not a peaceful market town. These were walls built to withstand attack. The towers were designed for archers. The gates were reinforced with massive wooden beams. Rival tribes constantly threatened the frankincense routes. Desert raiders attacked caravans. Competing merchants hired mercenaries to disrupt trade. The wealth of Yubar made it a target. The fortress was not just a symbol of power, it was necessary for survival. Inside the walls, life followed the rhythm of the caravans. When a caravan arrived from the south, the city would burst into activity. Camels were watered and fed. Frankincense was weighed and evaluated. Merchants negotiated prices. Traders from distant lands displayed their wares. For a few days, Yubar would be crowded, noisy, alive with commerce. Then the caravan would depart north, and the city would settle back into quiet. The permanent population was probably only a few hundred people. But its influence reached across the ancient world. The religious texts had preserved the memory, even if they had transformed the details into moral lessons. The Quran speaks of the people of Ad, a tribe that lived in a great city and defied the warnings of the prophet Hud. According to the text, God destroyed them for their arrogance and idolatry. Medieval Islamic scholars debated whether this story was literal or metaphorical. Now we know that a city did exist. A city did fall. Whether divine judgment or geological catastrophe caused the collapse is a matter of faith, but the physical evidence is undeniable. Yubar was real, its destruction was real, and the memory of that destruction lived on in legend for 3,000 years, even after every stone was buried beneath the sand. The discovery raises uncomfortable questions about history and memory. How many other legends are we dismissing as myth when they might preserve genuine historical events? How many lost cities remain buried because we refuse to take folklore seriously? The academic establishment had written off Yubar as fantasy for centuries. It took an amateur filmmaker and satellite technology to prove them wrong. The Bedouin had always known something was there. Indigenous knowledge preserved the location and the basic story, but Western scholarship ignored them, assuming that oral tradition could not be trusted, that legendary cities could not be real. Yubar proves that assumption was arrogant and wrong. The desert peoples had maintained accurate information across 100 generations. Their stories were not fantasies. They were history, passed down in the only form that could survive when all written records had disappeared. Today, the site of Yubar lies partially excavated in southern Oman. The Omani government has built a small museum near the ruins. Tourists can visit, though few do. The empty quarter remains empty, but archaeologists continue to work at the site, uncovering more of the settlement, mapping the extent of the sinkhole, analyzing the pottery and artifacts that reveal connections to the wider ancient world. Each season brings new discoveries. Each discovery confirms that this was not just a small desert outpost. This was a major center of trade, a city that functioned for thousands of years before geology and water and the fragile relationship between humans and the desert environment conspired to destroy it in a single catastrophic moment. The sinkhole is still there. You can stand at the edge and look down into the crater where buildings collapsed 17 centuries ago. In certain light, you can still see stone columns protruding from the rubble at the bottom. The limestone walls of the cavern are visible, showing where the roof finally gave way after millennia of erosion. It is one of the most dramatic archaeological sites in the world, and one of the least visited. The empty quarter does not attract tourists. The heat is oppressive. The isolation is absolute. There are no hotels, no restaurants, no infrastructure for visitors. To reach Yubar requires a four-wheel drive vehicle, a guide who knows the desert, and a willingness to travel hours across sand dunes to reach a few stone walls emerging from the ground. Most people who hear about Yubar never see it in person, but those who make the journey describe it as profoundly moving. Standing in the ruins of a city that was forgotten for 3,000 years, looking out at the infinite sand that buried it, you cannot help but wonder what else is out there. What other cities lie beneath these dunes? What other civilizations have vanished so completely that we have lost even their names? The frankincense trade itself collapsed long before Yubar disappeared. By the time of Jesus, the routes were declining. The Romans had discovered sea routes to India that bypassed Arabia entirely. Frankincense was still valuable, but the desert caravans were no longer essential. The wealth that had sustained Yubar for millennia began to dry up just as literally as the wells. When the sinkhole opened, it merely finished what economic changes had already begun. The city was probably already in decline, its population reduced, its glory days long past. The collapse simply ensured that there would be no recovery, no gradual abandonment, no slow fade into history. Yubar ended suddenly, violently, with the earth opening beneath it. And then the sand came, and the memory dimmed, and within a few generations only legends remained. We stand now at a unique moment in archaeology. Satellite technology allows us to see beneath the sand in ways previous generations could never imagine. Ground-penetrating radar reveals structures without excavation. LiDAR mapping shows us ancient cities hidden under jungle canopy. The tools we have today would have seemed like magic to archaeologists a century ago. And yet, with all this technology, we have barely begun to search. The empty quarter alone covers an area larger than France. How much of it has been scanned? How many other Ubars lie beneath those dunes, waiting for the right combination of technology and curiosity to reveal them? The Arabian Peninsula is littered with ruins that no one has ever properly investigated. Local people know they are there. Bedouin tribes have been avoiding certain areas for generations because their grandparents told them ancient cities were buried there. Are they all myths? Or are they all Ubars, waiting to be rediscovered? The city of Ubar forces us to reconsider what we think we know about human civilization. We imagine progress as linear. We assume that once humans build cities, once they establish trade networks, once they create wealth and culture and architecture, these things are permanent. We forget how fragile it all is. A city that controlled the frankincense trade for 3,000 years disappeared in an afternoon. The earth opened, the buildings fell, the survivors walked away. And within a few generations, even the location was forgotten. If it can happen to Yubar, it can happen to anyone. It can happen to us. Our cities are built on geology we barely understand. Our infrastructure depends on systems we take for granted. We assume the ground beneath our feet is solid, that the water will always flow, that the environment that sustains us will remain stable. Yubar is a reminder that these assumptions are dangerous. The desert is patient. The sand is always waiting. And when civilizations fall, they fall hard enough that future generations might dismiss them as myths. The last stones are being uncovered now as you listen to this. Archaeologists are still working at Yubar, still finding pottery, still mapping the extent of the settlement. Each artifact they pull from the sand is a voice from the past, a message from people who thought their city would last forever. The frankincense merchants who built their stone houses, the traders who came from Persia and Rome, the Bedouin tribesmen who watered their camels at wells that tapped into ancient aquifers. They are all silent now. Their city is a ruin. Their trade routes are buried under 40 feet of sand, but they were real. They lived, they built, they thrived. And then, in a moment of geological violence that they could neither predict nor prevent, everything they had created fell into darkness. The Atlantis of the sands was never a myth. It was a warning, and we have only just begun to understand what it was warning us about.